Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I don't know. It sounds kind of dead right now. Yeah. Well, good. That's why we have Tony this morning to liven everyone up. Again, thanks for getting up early. Hopefully, you have had enough food and coffee to keep yourself awake. We have another packed schedule for this morning and the afternoon, and we'll get going with Tony's talk. If there's any questions during the day you have any, or you want to follow up on anything, please contact me or Noel. Also, if you have any other feedback beyond, like, you want to put on the surveys, which are at all the spots, we'd love for you to fill those in and drop them off. You can also send email to eScience@Microsoft.com if you want to do it electronically. Sometimes paper is easier. You never know. So, well, we'll get going, and thanks. And want to introduce Tony Hay, who's newly to Microsoft in the last, 2 months, 3 months?
3 months.
3 months now. And our vice president of what's called our Technical Computing Initiative. And he's going to talk about some of the stuff he was doing actually partially beforehand, his thoughts on the eScience and the Cyberinfrastructure.
Yes, thanks very much, Dan. So it's nice to be in Microsoft. And what I'll try and tell you is some of my views on cyber infrastructure, which is the US word for what in Europe is called e-infrastructure for eScience. And I'll try and explain both those terms, what I mean by them, as we go along. And they're largely formed by my previous job, where I spent 5 years running the equivalent of an NSF program on eScience. Okay, so I didn't coordinate with Jim, but Jim's vision is very similar to my vision, which is quite similar to Marvin's vision. So we're almost lined up, but we haven't had time to iron out the wrinkles. But this is what I believe is the primary motivation. This is the original motivation for the ARPANET, which then became the Internet. So JCR Licklider, one of my heroes, had the concept. He was actually a psychologist at Harvard, and he realized he spent most of his time, as we heard yesterday, assembling the data before he could actually do his research on the data. So he worked with some military contracts about human-computer interface in the 50s, and then he had this vision, all of the stuff linked together throughout the world. You can use remote computers, data from a remote computer, lots of computers in your job. So that was the vision, and what he did was fund, he didn't know how to do it, of course, when he went to ARPA. So what he did was he actually funded computer science departments in MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, CMU, UCLA, and he called them his extragalactic networking team. And they figured out all the stuff that we now know as the Internet, TCP, IP, and so on. So this was Larry Roberts, one of the early architects of the Internet. But that, I think, is what we're trying to do. Of course, the killer application for that was, of course, email first and then the web. So Tim Berners-Lee developed the web at CERN. He wasn't a physicist, particle physicist, although he's sometimes claimed by the particle physicists. And it was a tool because the physicists have very extended collaborations, really truly global, certainly continental, and they needed to build complex apparatus, and they needed to exchange information. And so he envisaged this tool and invented little play ones, and then eventually launched what has now become the World Wide Web. And the first website in the USA was in this community. It was at Stanford, in the Stanford Linear Accelerator. Library catalog was made available on the web. And it was the international particle physics community who first embraced the web, but of course Mosaic and everything else led to huge applications in all areas of life, as we know. So why do we need more? Well, okay, so my background is in the technical community, and that's the community I hope to be working with. And what are they doing now? Well, they're actually trying to raise their sights doing the next generation scientific problems along the lines that Jim was talking about yesterday. So they're going beyond the capabilities of a static web access on the World Wide Web. They want to use remote computing resources. They want to integrate, federate, analyze information for many distributed data sources. They want to access and control remote experimental pieces, sensor networks, and so on. So the capability to access, move, manipulate, and mine data is the central requirement of these new collaborative networked science. And the data can be in databases, it could be generated by telescopes or accelerators, or it could be mobile sensor networks or even static sensor networks or whatever. So these are the sort of challenges that we saw yesterday, and I think are the hallmark of what will be needed to be done in the future. And what we really want to enable is not the scientists to spend all their time building the glue, but as Dennis described in his talk on LEAD yesterday, is actually to have a layer above the internet where this glue is hardened and actually works, and not everybody spends all their time reinventing wheels. So, I mean, there was a talk yesterday who was looking for the origins of eScience. The origins of eScience, I think, go back to John Taylor. He was, the Office of Science and Technology in the UK is the equivalent of the NSF in the US. So he came from industry, he came from Hewlett-Packard's research labs, and he saw all these bids from these different scientific communities for more money. But he realized, because he came from Hewlett-Packard, where they've long had a vision for computing as a utility, pay on demand, like your telephone, this is the sort of, you don't buy resources, you just buy services. So he put this together with a vision about eScience being about global collaboration in many areas of science. There's still room for individual researchers who don't need any of it, of course. And if people have a supercomputer problem, they can just go to the supercomputer. They don't necessarily need all the infrastructure that we're building for them. But the next generation of infrastructure to enable it. That's really what we're trying to do with the cyber infrastructure. But I would just like to emphasize that eScience is not a new scientific discipline. For me, it's a set of technologies and tools which allow scientists to do their research. That's what we're about. Enabling scientists to do really groundbreaking research. And I stole a phrase from adverts for web services, where they say web services will allow business to be faster, better, or different. That's what we're trying to do. Making something fast by giving access to computational resources can make a problem that was impossible before suddenly possible. Similarly, you can do it with higher quality. You get data everywhere. There were some studies on tamoxifen, breast cancer drugs, and looking at small studies, you couldn't tell whether there was a real effect. When you aggregated studies around the world, you knew perfectly well that tamoxifen was a really wonder drug for treating breast cancer. And similarly, different research. So let me give one example to give you the idea. Now, in the UK, we have been doing this for 5 years, and I'm very glad that the US has finally caught on, all right? And we have about 100 projects, so I'm not going to give 100 projects here, and they're really, not all of them are interesting, but many of them are really quite interesting. So let me just tell you about some of them. So systems biology, we heard last night, has not been mentioned much, but this is a systems biology project, and it typifies the sort of thing that the scientists want to do. Now, there is a group in Oxford who do world-breaking research in modeling in detail the electrical signals in heart cells. So when a protein attaches, what happens in the chemical reactions to generate electrical behavior in the cell. And they're very good at it, and they publish papers. They're scholarly people, and they're well respected around the world. They're led by Dennis Noble. Similarly, in New Zealand, there is a group under Peter Hunter in Auckland. His brother was mentioned yesterday in the talk from MIT. But what they do is they're world famous for doing mechanical models of a beating heart. Now, what this project is trying to do is to allow these groups of people to collaborate. And what you want to do is enable researchers in Oxford to access not necessarily the compute resources, but the data, the models, the programs in each other's place, and to be able to send jobs out to a supercomputer. So they want to build an infrastructure suitable for doing their systems biology project. And what it will enable you to do, it will enable you to go from gene defects, which means the protein that has a slightly different form and maybe causes a slightly different heart signal on the cell, which you integrate up over the heart, and it causes arrhythmia or a heart attack. And once you can get a link to genetic defects, you can perhaps have cure, and pharmaceutical companies could actually come in and actually do this. So by linking these two groups to work together, you can hopefully do a totally different type of research that these two groups together can't do. So that's the idea, all right? So the UK Science Initiative, this is what I was doing before I came to Microsoft, is about a $400 million initiative over 5 years, which is aimed at the next generation, what does it say here? Multidisciplinary collaborative science and engineering, which I think is what we're about. And what we've done is do a lot of experiments, and then we realized we have to have some infrastructure to support that. So we've been building bits of what we think, besides having the internet, you need a layer of services on top. Obvious services are authentication, authorization, and so on. But there are other services of the type that Dennis and others talked about yesterday. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to establish an infrastructure. And of course, it can't be national. It has to be global. And so that's one of the reasons why we have been at pains in the UK program to work closely with our US colleagues and our colleagues around the world. What I particularly liked about the UK program was I was in charge of a piece of it, and part of that piece was actually about interesting companies, collaborative industrial projects in this sort of arena. And it was, to me, surprising that we managed to get about 80 companies actually looking at this, what was clearly bleeding-edge technology. You notice I haven't mentioned Globus, right? I have not mentioned Globus because that's only a small part of the picture. So, but nonetheless, this is really a dream at the moment, a vision, and the question is, can it be translated into some business benefit for these companies? And these companies were willing to have a look, and I think I'll show at the end, if I have time, just some examples of where there really could be real business benefit. And it's no point, as I said, being an island, as we are in the UK. So one of the things we have to spread a common vision of this cyber infrastructure around the world. Well, the US, since I stole many elements of our UK program from the best features of the US, there's a lot of commonality there. But there is also in China, Australia, most places in Europe, now have eScience programs, which are very similar to this vision. So that gives me some hope that we can actually get to this stage. Okay, so I'm not going to go through 100 projects, and I will just go through a few examples which I think are interesting. I won't go through particle physics. You know that they have really global infrastructure, and they want to move data around and do computation. It's computation of a particularly easy type that what they're doing at the Large Hadron Collider, 2 particles come in, create a stream of particles. And then another 2 particles come in, create another stream of particles. So each event is independent from the previous event. And so you can just analyze these on different machines. No communication is needed. It's trivial computing, embarrassingly parallel, if you like, but they have a lot of data. They have petabytes of data. They have a very disparate collaborative thing. And then astronomy, I don't think I'm going to talk about the NVO and AstroGrid in front of Jim Gray, but this is putting multiple wavelengths together to actually do multiple, when you look at a piece of sky and you see something in the infrared, actually, when you want to figure out what the processes are going on, you need to know what's happening in the visible, the X-ray, and so on. I did fund a project which is interesting, which I won't talk about other than just say a word here, which is actually looking at a different type of thing, not this multi-wavelength. It's looking at real-time astronomy. And so we have a project which actually allows astronomers to control a chain of optical telescopes around the world. So we have an educational one where school kids in London can actually control a telescope in Hawaii and look for comets or look for near-Earth collision objects and things like that, access databases of astronomy around the world. And that's an educational one. But there's a real use, too, because what you can do with these rather maneuverable optical telescopes, they're not huge, they're small, but they're around the world in various places, including the southern hemisphere. You have a gamma-ray burst. In order to reorient the Hubble Space Telescope to do that takes many months of negotiation. But these little light telescopes you can actually reorient. And so there's a paper showing a gamma-ray burst, and then within 3 minutes they've oriented the telescope to the same region of sky and are looking at the optical emission. So this is a new type of astronomy, which is, if you like, real-time, correlating across the different wavelengths. I said I wouldn't talk about that. Okay. But actually, I do find some of the things actually really exciting. Right? And so we just had an all-hands meeting in Nottingham. We have one every year. We had 650 people, and it's genuinely multidisciplinary. A third computer scientists, a third scientists, and a third is the infrastructure people, the computing center directors, and so on. So it's a really exciting mix. But I will talk about chemistry, bioinformatics, healthcare, and I'll give you one project from the environment, especially for Jeff. Okay. So this is a very exciting chemistry project, and this is one of my mistakes, right? So they have, over here, a wet lab. And instead of doing chemistry the way I used to do chemistry, take one compound, another compound, mix them to make a third compound. Here, this is combinatorial chemistry. They make thousands of compounds at a time. And what you have to do, it's a high-throughput device, and you have to annotate it, with what are the compound's temperature, pressure, constituents of this particular compound and that one and that one. And so it comes off so fast, you can't look at it all. You have to annotate it with metadata automatically. So that's one of the features. Then you may find some molecule that you want to make. You make it, you send it over here, and this is a remote-controlled grid service, I called it. That's a mistake, but I did call it that. And you can access this from Redmond. You can control, the technician will load your molecule in the robot arm. You can control it, compare it with the structures that are out there, determine the structure, compare it with a simulation of what the structure is. And that's what they want the middleware to do, the cyber infrastructure. Unfortunately, most of the grid middleware out there is just computing and just does the simulation. It doesn't do the knitting together. This is actually what we want to do, the workflow and all that. And this experiment has a number of other interesting features which I just like to pick up on. So that's what they want to do, and it's a very interesting experiment in many respects. So they have a digital lab book, and we heard about that, and getting chemists to abandon their notebooks. I'm now trying to go to a tablet. It's hard, all right? But getting the chemists to do it is quite difficult because you have to make it so it's flexible enough and it suits the way they want to work. And so we had an experiment in actually replacing it with a fully electronic version. And it says here they liked it. I'd like to go back in 6 months and see if they're actually using it. But that's the sort of thing we did. This is not 3 students drinking in the bar. This is 3 students monitoring their experiment in the lab, checking that the temperature, the action rates are going, and getting it delivered by GPRS over a PDA. All right? So that's another aspect. That will happen everywhere. We'll be doing remote monitoring of experiments. And this is another feature I like of this. All right? So you produce lots of crystallographic data of these rather small molecules, and you can't publish all that data, but you publish the results of the analysis of that data. Now, people may actually be interested in that and say, well, I don't believe that, or how do they do that? And so what they're doing, not only do they produce an electronic paper, which is obviously what we do now, and we submit it to a journal, but we have an e-print, but you can link it to the actual original data. So this is what they call crystallographic e-prints, and these are stored in a data center in the UK, a national data store. And you can go and access this data, and this is being taken up by that well-known chemist Geoffrey Fox at Indiana, who has a chemistry grant from NIH to do something similar in the US, which I think is a very good thing, linked with these people here. And this is their vision for the future, all right? And this is actually, they have a project which is looking at this sort of hole in the round. So you have the experimentation, you have the institutional archive, publisher holdings, web, preprints, metadata, technical reports, and the actual data itself, digital library of all the apparatus. And this becomes part of the way you teach students, undergraduates, graduate students. It's a whole cycle. And I like the vision. Making it a reality will be a challenge, of course. Okay, so we heard yesterday about what is, I think, one of the major challenges of this century, which is the bioinformatics challenge. And I just put up here a composite of the different types of data. I talked about the particle physics data being all the same. Lots of it, but it's all the same. Here you see you have gene sequences of letters, that's all they are. You have microarray data. It tells you what protein the gene expresses. And then you have to figure out what the protein is a complex three-dimensional structure. Then you have to take one of the target molecules which might block that protein acting, so you do docking calculations. And then you want to put it with your DNA, my DNA, our SNP profile, and to see if we can get drugs. There is some statistic like only 30% of the drugs prescribed actually have any effect because we have a different genetic makeup. So the whole aim of the pharmaceutical industry is to have personalized medicine where they link it to classes of DNA defects. And that's the hope here. But really, it's really a welter of data, and you want to go from data to information to knowledge. And that's the emphasis. Okay, so this project is an extremely interesting project. It's been collaborating with the Bern project in San Diego, Mark Ellisman and company, and with other colleagues in the US. So there's good connections here. And I'll just give you an example of my target audience in the UK. The target audience is a graduate student, because the graduate students will understand the technology, pick it up faster, and then educate their advisors. All right? That's the goal, because the professors never have time to do it. So this is a particular disease called Williams-Buren, and with this computer scientist, they sat down and developed workflows. The graduate student used to have to go every week to go and look at the databases, see what had been changed, search them, and so on each week. And they put these things to make life easier. And this is her verdict on the process. She believes that workflows have made her life really easy. They get correct results, and they actually have found some new evidence in Williams-Buren for a different part of the genome which actually affects that disease, saves time, increases productivity. You can share, you can show people, how did you get that result? You give them the workflow. Of course, it may be on different data. The data may have changed, so you need to worry about the provenance. But it gives you a different way of doing your work. And that's actually what the computer science challenge is to assist the bioinformaticians to do their work. And I'll come back to that. But that's a small success, but it is a success, and it's a graduate student doing work. This is healthcare. Now, I think healthcare is, in fact, a killer application for eScience. All right? So that's meant to be a joke. Okay. I'm glad Jeff, you know, it's always good to have Jeff in the audience, because he catches on so late. All right? So this is a project with IBM and a number of hospitals. In the UK, we have a national health service. That means, in principle, we could actually get a huge database of all different diseases and do everything. Of course, it's not like that. So let's look at one particular disease, breast cancer, one particular image, which is an X-ray mammogram, and see what can be done. And that's what the goal of this project was. So they do screening for mammograms nationally, as you do here. And the difficulty is that the mammograms are, at the moment, mainly analog, but they can be digital in the future. They need to be high enough resolution so you can look at them on a screen, and a doctor can really detect what they can detect from holding up a photograph. And I think that's now just about possible. So the idea is to digitize these mammograms, which are held in different hospitals, in Oxford, in London, in Edinburgh, are the hospitals involved in this project. But that's not enough, because these mammograms are taken by radiologists on different types of machines, different types of year, different exposures, and in order to take out that, it requires an expert. Or what we had was a spin-off company from Mike Brady in Oxford, who developed what they called very complex image processing, a modeling of the breast tissue and so on, to develop a standard mammographic format. So you take out the machine dependencies with all the metadata of the machines to get a standard mammographic format. And then you can compare, all right? And so this project then allows you to do diagnosis, epidemiology, or you could use it for training. So someone in the boondocks, where are the boondocks in America? North Dakota or somewhere like that, actually, who doesn't see many breast cancer patients, could dial up and see 100 patients between the ages of 48 and 50 with the same pathology. And that's the goal of this. And if you can do that, it would really be a big payoff. It's more difficult in the US, as we discussed, because you have privatized medicine, but in principle in the UK you could do it. It's not so easy, and we haven't succeeded yet. And there are, of course, many other issues like privacy, ethics, security, anonymization, all that sort of stuff have to be solved. But if you can solve it, there's a really big win there. And so, again, working with NCI in the US, I think, again, we need to try and put these things together. So this vision is part of the strategy of our National Cancer Research Institute, and they're working with NIH and Ken Buteau and people like that with the CA Big project. And we have other projects called Cancer Grid, which is also linked to the US activity. This is I put this in to show that there is some computer science research floating around here, besides this heavy-duty image processing. Incidentally, the heavy-duty image processing of these mammograms, hospitals don't want to run supercomputer centers. If you are running it as a service, you can outsource this service. You can have a company that processes mammograms for hospitals, and that's what they want. They want to buy a service. So I think this does lead to businesses. There is a world shortage of radiographers, and so my AI people in the UK, in fact at my university, sat down with radiologists and developed a vocabulary, which they call by an ontology, but it's a controlled vocabulary for how they describe an image. And so when they describe the image using this vocabulary, then we can use some computer science smart technology to do automatic generation of patient reports. Now, I'm not pretending this is actually ready for prime time, but it's an interesting start. And I think these technologies may have something that can help us deal with the huge amounts of data and people that we have to deal with. And we have many environmental projects. Some of them, again, are really quite interesting. So one of them is if someone falls overboard when they're sailing on Lake Washington or whatever. In the UK, we have a lifeguard which they send a signal and then they send out a helicopter to rescue them. But actually, by the time they get there, they've drifted down because of the wind or the current. And so we have a search and rescue information system which is now linked to real-time data from the Met Office. And that's the sort of, again, disaster relief thing. You can do it for oil slicks, you can do it for fires and so on. That's just the beginning of this type of thing. But this is another project here, as we talked about, using the Berkeley software BOINC, as we heard about yesterday. And these are some numbers: 95,000 registered participants, 150 countries, 8,000 years of computer time, 100,000 simulations, 4 million model years. Very impressive. And it's slightly different from the SETI at home example we heard about yesterday, in that here you have to send your computer and it's running a reasonably state-of-the-art climate modeling code of some years back. It's not the very fine resolution coupled model that you run on the Earth simulator, which is 30 teraflops. This is getting 30 teraflops by 30,000 gigaflop machines. So you run a different type of code, and what they're looking is all the different parameters. They're simulating the climate from 1950 to 2050, all right? And what they're trying to do is explore the sensitivity of these models to various of these parameters, which we don't know very well, the initial starting parameters. And it may be that some parameters are particularly sensitive, in which case we need to go and find out. Now, at the moment, the model's not as realistic as we would like, and they're putting a coupled ocean model in as we speak. But nonetheless, you can see some interesting results. And you can actually go and do it with your school. You could do it in Microsoft. You could do it whatever. And you could have your school have a whole range of related parameters. You can do statistics. What's the predicted CO2 concentration in Seattle in 2050? What's the sea level? What's the temperature? And so on. And so this is a result of one of their papers, as was referred to yesterday. Most of the models give the sort of 3 or 4 degree warming trend. Some give cooling, but some give 10 degrees warming. And it therefore means it's a totally different way of looking at climate prediction models, as opposed to doing the very high resolution that you need a monster supercomputer to do. And we have obviously other environmental projects. Okay, so enough examples. I think you get the picture, and we have examples similar to the ones we heard yesterday, and if you're interested, look at the websites in the UK. So I made, perhaps it was a mistake, I don't know, but I called this infrastructure the grid. And I was using this definition from Foster and Kesselman. It's not what their software does, but this is the vision. And it's about what we need is a flexible, secure, coordinated resource sharing among dynamic collections of individuals, institutions, and resources. That's what we want, right? Now, these virtual organizations, then, could be like the particle physicists. Those experiments will go on for 10 years. So the universities in different things will be in that virtual organization for 10 years, and they need to be authenticated to be able to share resources. But we want to do this. But it is not just about compute cycles. It's more about the data. And that's probably one thing Jim and I agree on, all right, that it is about the data. But the long-term goal, as Dennis emphasized, is to have the infrastructure so that the scientists don't have to reinvent it every time and being diverted. I know it's quite fun doing these things, but really they're supposed to be doing science. And it would be better not to keep rebuilding the wheel. So this is a word I stole from Bill Johnson, routinely. We want to enable them not to have, 2 people with PhDs in computer science at either end sorting out the system problems. We want to be able to do it routinely and securely. So that's what we're trying to build. And I call the word grid, and that's what I mean by grid. And I need to talk to Marvin, because Marvin's talking about only within an organization. Here, the scientists clearly need to go between organizations. So we have to rationalize our definition of the Microsoft grid, so you can help us. Just a few little quotes here just to, before I finish up. The Atkins report on cyber infrastructure is now, I think, going to be implemented. The NSF have now set up a cyber infrastructure office. And I just thought some of the other trends that I see. Primary access to latest findings in growing number of fields is through the web. then through preprints and conferences, and lastly through archival papers. It may take many years to get a paper into a real official journal. In fast-moving fields, you don't look at it. That's only for getting tenure. What you do it for, to do your research, you actually collaborate at conferences and electronic versions. And the other thing they pointed out, archives containing hundreds of thousands of terabytes of data will be affordable and necessary for archiving scientific and engineering applications. Two clear trends. And this is another vision I like. I'm not sure I like the particular software, but this vision I think is correct, that libraries in universities need to evolve. What does a library do? It doesn't need to have large numbers of copies of 1930s phys rev articles on shelves. Those shelves can be abolished and made into student housing. It'd be very good. You could have little slots for students, like they do in Japan. Because actually you only need a few of these things, and they're all available electronically now. What does a library do? Well, in my view, this is a good vision. Much of the material produced by faculty, such as data sets, experimental results, and rich media, as well as conventional documents, articles, papers, and so on, are housed on individual hard drive, departmental web server. Such material is often lost forever as things change. The average life of a web page is a few months, and so on. So these are serious issues, and if you have a logbook which is electronic, there could be a court case about some patent, and you need to go and demonstrate. You need to worry about these sort of issues when we're living in an electronic world. So that vision is, I think, something that we need to take seriously. And of course, besides the archival papers, there's all the grey literature. There's theses, there's technical reports, all that sort of stuff. And in MIT, you also have lecture notes, but that's a slightly controversial thing for academics. And just lastly, a large number of organizations have signed the Berlin Declaration, which has a very noble vision to promote the Internet as a functional instrument for global scientific knowledge base and for human reflection. And it defines open access not only as the literature, but also original scientific results, data and metadata, source materials, digital representations of pictorial, etc. So it's a rather broad thing, and this principle of open access is typified by the talk we heard on Whirlwind yesterday. We paid for that data to be taken. We should have access to it. Our taxes paid for it. And similarly with PubMed Central, we've paid for the researchers to do this research. You should allow access to it. So I think there's a moral case here which I think is unassailable. So a comment just echoing Jim's. Next 5 years, I think it's absolutely obvious that we will produce more scientific data than we have in the whole of human history. So that's really a worrying thing, because can we analyze it? We'll be drowning in data. Bible's 5 megabytes. Library of Congress is 20 terabytes. We're talking about petabytes in many, many fields. Huge surveys in astronomy, sensor networks, satellite data, and so on. Almost every field you look at. And so I believe that I've heard a lot about Excel, and I only used Excel for doing examination spreadsheets when I was chair of my department. But I must go and find out about its other functionalities. What I can guarantee, if you store data in a spreadsheet, in 20 years' time, that version of the spreadsheet certainly won't exist. The version of the operating system certainly won't exist. The hardware that you used to run it on won't exist. How can you all these calculations and things, the clever things are encoded there. How do you preserve that? So you do need research on these curation technologies and workflow, provenance, preservation, and I think this is a really interesting area, liaising with research communities, data archivists, librarians. I think they all have something to bring to the picture, along with computer scientists. So that's what we've set up, a digital curation centre in Cambridge in the UK as part of our infrastructure, because we do believe you need to do that. But there's a lot to be done there, and I hope that the Technical Computing Initiative will be looking at some of these issues. So I see the key drivers for eScience. Well, there's access to these large facilities like the LHC. The ITER is the fusion reaction, the global next generation for fusion, which could be critical for energy, as we hear today. That's going to be built in France, so US scientists, UK scientists will need to be able to access and interact with it remotely. Again, this is the middleware layer, the Cyberinfrastructure. I think we need some open standard. This is Microsoft, I hope, speaking. Open standard, interoperable middleware, and there can be a commercial version produced by Microsoft with .NET and a commercial version with IBM WebSphere, but there can also be an open source reference implementation, which the academic community do, which will interact both with the commercial versions. So a small company or some researchers don't have to invest huge amounts of money to get started because they can use the open source version, but it will interact with the commercial versions. So that's the vision. And the data deluge and the open access movement. I think these are key trends which are driving the way science is going. So just then some eScience visions. One vision is connecting supercomputers. That's fine. TeraGrid symbolizes that, and that has some value. Another vision is the SETI at home, climate prediction, and so on. Vision of public idle cycle grids. That's fine. Particle physicists have a particular vision of the grid. What I think underpins all of those is what I would call a plug-and-play grid of composable services, sort of thing that Dennis was talking about, where you compose more complex services out of rather simple services. And that's really what GGF is trying to do, not with great success at the moment, but I hope that progress will be made. Robust, interoperable, open standard middleware services. I meant to put it in last night, my talk, a quotation from Steve Barner, where he says, Microsoft will support open standard and interoperability. Right? So I'm quoting Steve. So these are the elements I think you need. High bandwidth research networks, authentication, authorization infrastructures. We need to get the middleware okay, and that means some software engineering, technologies and standards for data curation, provenance, open access, and we also need discovery and tools. Those are the sort of things. So those are the elements, I think, that are needed globally, and I think in the US and Europe and Asia, we should collaborate to build those, and Microsoft wants to help the community build those things. That's what we're trying to do. And of course, there's the web service magic bullet, as I was talking about. You can have .NET, you can have J2EE, and they will all work together. That's the promise of web services. Okay, so I'll just whip through these because I'm over time. But I would like to emphasize that this is not just an academic space. So looking at Marvin over here, I think this is actually a commercial space in the fullness of time. But I think it's appropriate that the scientific community do the bleeding edge, far out problems, and they will filter down as they become commodity into the commercial space. So these are some courageous companies that actually are looking at this space already. So the BBC broadcasts from London to Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, and it's a very centralized service. So they've been researching, distributing that as a grid, and that allows them to bring in different types of services. You can customize it, you can add redundancy and fault tolerance and all that sort of stuff. That's what they want to do. They want a grid infrastructure underlying it, working with BT to provide that, and it's looking at all these sort of issues. And that project started as a little pilot and is now being taken to the next stage. This is one with Rolls-Royce. As you fly on as I fly back to England, I'm very comforted by this engine beside me, which goes on for 12 hours unchanged. But at the time, it sends out to its sensors temperature, pressure, vibration data, which they'd like to monitor in flight. At the moment, they can't do that because the bandwidth from the aircraft is not big enough. The next generation, the bandwidth is going to be increased. Do you know why? It's to allow passengers to access the internet and things like that. But actually, they will also be able to send data down to monitor it in flight. So at the moment, they monitor it at the beginning and take off at end. But what they'd like to do is to be able to download it to diagnostic centers. There's one in the US and one in the UK, and there probably will be one in Asia, where they have the whole history of that engine, all the engines like it, and they have a simulation of what the engine should be doing, what you should see. They can compare, they can do complicated data mining, neural network technologies are used to see if there's some potential maintenance problem. And this is just one example of industrial maintenance. This is actually a tip of an iceberg. You can imagine any plant that is distributed looks, for 30 years or whatever, like an oil plant, like a offshore oil rig, like a power plant. These are the sort of things. So here, that takes off in New York, lands in London. They'd like to notify the maintenance center so they replace the part before you have to take the engine off the wing and give it routine maintenance. And this is the sort of clever technologies they're exploring signals. I have a list of what faults you can get, but it scares me, so I didn't put it up, right? Okay, so this is another type of project. This is one of our projects, which is in bioinformatics, and this has progressed. It was a good project, but they now are commercializing it. So they're selling some software, and I'll show you the software. But it's looking at high-throughput informatics, bioinformatics and environmental with sensors and stuff like that. They won a prize at supercomputing, and they've been working with the Shanghai people, looking at how the SARS virus mutates using their tools. So this is the spin-off. So this is generating some new business. I think this is actually, eScience will actually spin off lots of innovative companies. So this is InfoSense, which is an informatics platform. And the next slide is a marketing slide. So beware. I don't know if it actually is as good as this or not, but this is the sort of thing they're trying to do. So you have a very complicated space in a pharma lab. You have chemists have to talk to biologists, to geneticists, and all these sort of things. And you want to do all these things, and they have to talk to each other. There really is a workflow. And so these guys claim they can do visualizing data clusters, they can multidimensional data, sequence data, pathway data, text mining, all these sort of things that you need to do. So this is what they claim to do, and this has now been, in some sense, adopted by BAEgrid project in the USA. At least they have a relationship with them. But those are the sort of things that this project claims to do. And lastly, British Aerospace, they're a major engineering company, and they do virtual organizations all the time. They collaborate with Boeing on the next fighter aircraft, and they also collaborate with Airbus to compete with Boeing. So they have these sort of Chinese walls, and it's very complicated, and they would like better tools to do these cross-boundary virtual organizations. So people from Boeing who need to use BAE data only have access to this data and can't see the Airbus data and so on. And so there are many projects they've been involved in. This is one which is remote control of a wind tunnel, and this is a picture of the wind tunnel here. And what they're doing here actually is interesting technology. So they have two British Aerospace sites and a wind tunnel supplier over here, and a research organization as well, Manchester University, and these are collaborating. And on this, they're trying to put on clever technology. It's called pressure-sensitive paint. Making these models is extremely expensive. You want to measure what the flow is, you have to put taps on the models, and the models get very expensive. Here you can make cheap models, and you paint it with pressure-sensitive paint, which glows different colors, and you can actually tell then without putting these complicated taps, and you might have put the tap in the wrong place, and so on. So this is what they're doing, and what they want to do is they absolutely care about security, and so what they've developed here is a fingerprint authentication. So in order to get on this machine, you have to put your fingerprint, you get a session, and you're authenticated by your fingerprint. Okay, so what they see is they see grids are information architecture for networked organizations. That's how they see grids. Connectivity is not collaboration, so that you need to go more than just connecting, and you need to worry about this deep interoperability, and security is one of their primary concerns. Okay, well, that's enough. I better stop. But I do believe that eScience, as we see today and yesterday, has the potential to transform the way we do many fields of science. Not everything, but many ways we do science. And I think this will trickle down into industry and be taken up by the pharma industry, by the engineers, by the petrochemical industry initially, and then other industries. So I do believe that the middleware we're producing will actually stimulate business applications and opportunities for innovation. I think it's absolutely the right way is not to try and reinvent the wheel. The IT industry believe internet-scale distributed computing is best done with a service-oriented architecture using web services. I think this is sensible, and so we should actually exploit, not reinvent. We should exploit all the tooling and the effort and the development environments that the IT industry is putting into making this possible. VisualStudio.net is one such environment, which really makes it easy to deploy web services. And what we'd like to do in Microsoft is work with the scientific community to develop such open standard interoperable systems. And that's one of the goals of our technical computing initiative. The other one is to use this technology to do great science. So we'd like to have some relationships where we really push science in some specific areas where we can actually make a difference with all the tools and technologies. And we'd like to do it in as open a way as possible. So that's what we're struggling with now, and trying to put together a program. Clearly involves Microsoft research. It also can involve the product groups too. And I'm open to ideas, and I would like some help in defining what Technical Computing Initiative does, and also what Microsoft's definition of a grid should be. I get really bored every morning now. I see on the television an advert for Oracle Grid, unbreakable. Oracle Grid is just a cluster, right? And for me, a grid has to go between one organizational domain to another, at the very least. It can be in the same organization as Marvin was talking about, or it could, I think, in these examples for the scientists, between different organizations or different groups, where we have to worry about firewalls and security. So we'd like to do it, and really we are open to suggestions, and I'm happy to talk to all of you. Not at the same time. So just a final quote. This is my highlight of my years in doing this was when I went to number 10 Downing Street. Tony Blair actually was preparing to give a talk on science to the Royal Society. I can think of no other political leader who would dare give a technical talk, a reasonably technical talk, on science to a Royal Society or the Royal Academy or the National Academy of Scientists, whatever. And he got briefed on energy and nanotechnology, all these things, and eScience was one of them. And so I had to think of what I would call the elevator definition of the grid. So this is it. You've got 5 seconds with the politician. So the grid intends to make access to computing power, scientific data repositories, and experimental facilities as easy as the web makes access to information. And it's not Tony Hay, it's Tony Blair. Right? And do you know what he said? And I told him that. He said, what was so special about the web? And it's not so easy to answer that question, because I don't want to talk about IP addresses and all that sort of stuff. But also it indicates a point. We need to make this infrastructure as easy to use as the web. And that's a real challenge for the whole of the computer science community and the scientists. So let's do that. And I'm sorry I rabbited on too long. Thank you. Sorry about that, Dan.
That's okay.
Marvin. I haven't defined the grid yet. No.
One of the key things that I think is crucial to keep in mind in building architectures. We talk about open access. I think it has to be controlled open access. The example of going BAE is one of the best examples there. You need something that allows you to say everybody can have access to these things.
So you need authentication and authorization. Absolutely.
So one of the things where we have a slight difference in the way we've been talking about things, I think we've been talking about critical level of sharing of services and the level of sharing of resources. Now, the level of sharing of services implicit in the whole idea of service-oriented architecture. Everything has a notion of controlled access. Everything is carefully controlled and audited and so forth, and I can therefore implement these ideas of this controlled thing. Resource sharing typically is done in a much finer grain and involves a security model that is much more fundamental to each other. And it's very important to understand the distinction between these two, otherwise you open yourself up to a situation where my resources are controlled by whoever chooses to try and access them.
Control is absolutely critical, and the third A, or accounting or audit, is also important. No, I absolutely agree, and I don't think these things are all sorted out in the academic community. I think in the commercial community we should sort out the intra ones first, which we can do. But this is where the scientific community wants to go, and we should assist them going there. But I don't think it's ready for product ship. No. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. No, I agree. Simon.
Can I just set your mind at rest about the Oracle 10G project? In BioSimGrid, we're actually using the 10G product in exactly the way that Marvin describes, to control inter-organization sharing of data, metadata, in precisely the way that Marvin described that using Oracle 10G.
Yeah, I've no problem with Oracle defining the grid as they want.
IBM defined it. It's not clusters.
Some defined it.
But it's not clusters. We're using the Oracle 10G in exactly the way that Marvin just described it in his definition of grid.
Very good. So I would like us to agree in Microsoft on a Microsoft marketing vision of the grid, all right, which actually would also be acceptable on an intellectual basis to this community and other communities. So that's what I'd like to do. Maybe impossible. Yes, May.
in terms of for you to look at all this topic, because what's important to science may not be important to computer science, the infrastructure.
Okay, so eScience has a value as tools and technologies enable the scientists to make the next generation problems. And so there's lots of computer science which doesn't do that, which does formal proof checking and things, makes better software. All those things are worthwhile. They're good things in computer science. Not everybody in the computer science community wants to do these things. But the goal of this thing is to make tools and technologies for scientists to do science. So, but it's not all of computer science. That I should make absolutely clear. Okay. I think I'm done. So I'll be around for the rest of the day.